All right. I might kick off. That's all right, Jamie, Jess, just for the sake of time. Welcome to those who've joined us for this session, Developmental Evaluation Beyond the Label. My name is Zoe Enticott and I'm a Principal Consultant with Clear Horizon. I'm going to be your host today. And I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we gather on traditional land. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and beyond, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today on the call. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country, and here in Wurundjeri land, it's March, which is look or eel season. So temperatures are starting to cool, eels are migrating downstream, and the days and the nights are equal length. So I just invite you to turn your attention to the traditional lands that you're joining from and the unique cultural and spiritual relationships held by First Nations peoples with the land, sky, the waters and seas in the place where you are. And I'd love to know where you're joining from today. So you're welcome to put the name of your traditional lands or countries in the chat. We've got Benedicta from Kulin Nation, also from Melbourne. Welcome. I'm really delighted today to welcome our two guests as well. We have Jamie Gamble from Imprint Consulting. Hi, Jamie, who's joining us all the way from Canada, and it's evening there, right, Jamie? What time is it where you're joining from?
7 p.m. and the days are getting longer. We're just going into spring, so it's feeling good.
There you go. Nice. Yes. And Jamie is a leading voice and author in developmental evaluation, including having authored a developmental evaluation primer and companion, which I found a really useful orientation to developmental evaluation. It's a fantastic reference for you all. And also we're joined by Jess Dart, who many of you will be familiar with. Jess is the founder and CEO of Clear Horizon and really well known in Australia and abroad for extensive MEL experience and specialising in MEL, which is measurement, evaluation and learning. I'll try to spell out all of my acronyms in complex and emergent settings, which we are going to be talking a lot about today. Hi, Jess. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is going to start with a guided discussion and we have some time for questions at the end. So if you've got any burning questions while Jamie and Jess are talking, you can put them in the Q&A function. Now there are two chats down the bottom of your screen. You'll see one of them is just called a chat box and one of them is called a Q&A. And so you can, as we're talking, you can actually make comments or talk with fellow participants in the chat function, or you can put in questions in the Q&A. So just remember that for the Q&A at the end, you want to be putting your questions in the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to answer as many as we can. We're also recording this because it's going to be a public resource, and there will be a follow-up email with all of the resources that get mentioned during the webinar. So if things come up and you'd love to learn more about them, examples that are shared, we are going to follow up and share all of that with you. So I'd like to just kick off with a quick warm-up question, and I'd love everyone joining online to have a go at answering this question as well. I'd love to know what's one thing that is currently energizing you in the world of evaluation strategy or design. And we're going to get responses from Jamie and Jess, but I'd also love to hear your thinking about what's one thing that's energizing you in the world of evaluation strategy or design. Jamie, I might begin with you.
I've been involved in a project the last couple of years that's knitting together leadership and large scale change. And it's been really, I think, quite inspiring for me because there's a ton of work out there on leadership. There's a ton of work out there on systems change. There's very little that's thinking about what does it mean to actually be leading in large scale systems change, both in terms of sort of trying to activate that, but also sort of steward organizations and networks through those kind of processes. Anyway, that's really kind of coming to an end right now, but I think there's some really useful insights and there is some distinct things that we need to pay attention to when they're in those roles. So that's quite jazzing for me. So look for something to come there soon. Yeah.
And you, Jess?
I'm interested in Jamie's example. It's, yeah, leadership. But anyway, I did have an example. Um, I guess I've been working, like Jamie, I'm doing lots of work in systems change, large scale initiatives, and thinking about how you measure it, particularly in what I call the messy middle of systems change. It's like we sort of know how to measure towards the end if there is population level change. We know how to do that, I think. I think we even know fairly well how to work as developmental evaluators in the beginning, but there's a middle bit that which is really messy where we begin to interact with the system and there's all sorts of signals and things changing and we have to sort of make sense of them. So I'm really excited about this idea of collective noticing and sense making that happens then, and it sort of draws on many threads of what we've been working on. The idea of collective noticing isn't new. I mean, MSC, outcomes harvesting, ripple effect monitoring, context monitoring, they're all part of that world. So it's sort of like piecing it together slightly differently and thinking of it and how we learn to do that. I think it's underdeveloped, so that always excites me where there's an opportunity to learn.
Excellent. Yeah, so many new things coming out of the world at the moment, and it's really interesting to hear that shift away necessarily from just a focus on methods and techniques to also a focus on ways of working, leadership, and collective noticing, these much more collaborative processes. We've got a couple of responses from people online as well. Joe is really interested in shifts to co-creation and co-production. Absolutely. Andrew is interested in the process of defining the problems, choosing the programs that aim to solve, who's part of the process, and what other framings are there or what is missing. Yeah, so it's that there's gaps in our understanding, our knowledge of who's involved in participatory processes. Great. All right, so let's start the discussion by defining developmental evaluation. And if I drop into the acronym DE, I'm talking about developmental evaluation. What is developmental evaluation and how was it originally conceived and applied? Jamie?
I think you ask 5 evaluators, you get 6 answers, but I think I would start by saying that it emerged in reaction to very static evaluation practice around highly structured programmatic evaluations, formative, summative, where programs were expected to actually stay pretty static through an evaluation period. And there was a lot of pushback from people who were just realizing we need to change in response to different contexts, changes in our community, new ideas. And so Michael Quinn Patton really originated this idea in the early 2000s, and it really took off in Canada around sort of the emergence of the idea of social innovation. And I would say, in essence, it's evaluation and taking what's best about evaluation being, systematic, thorough, and evidence-based, and applying that to the adaptive nature of change that happens when you're trying to intentionally innovate around a new solution, or you're, needing to respond creatively to major changes and shifts in what you're trying to do. And in that space of high complexity where you've got a lot of uncertainty and emergence. And so it's holding on to that rigor, but not buttoning it down so much that it's actually stifling or limiting, but it's actually enhancing to that process of innovation and complexity. Jess, I don't know, you probably have lots to add, so over to you.
I think that you nailed it. I mean, I guess it got developmental evaluation sort of grew up with social innovation, didn't it? It was like, how do we involve people in coming up with solutions? How do we use design and co-design? And at the same time, it was like a lot of my work at the beginning, like maybe last 10 years ago, would have been working in the front end, if you like. So before a program's formed, to sort of like test ideas and solutions and support the social innovation process. I guess that was maybe the dominant place where developmental evaluation was used. But Michael Patton did come up with those niches, didn't he? The different niches, and it wasn't constrained only to social innovation. It was also about ongoing iterative work. But I think most of the developmental evaluation has historically been around social innovation, making something new, solving a problem. But I guess it's worth just noting that the term developmental evaluation is a distinction about purpose, isn't it? So it is the idea of applying evaluation tools, skills, whatever, to the process of developing something iteratively. So you assume that it is not made yet. So the program is not fully designed, the initiative isn't set, and you are helping the development of it, which is quite a different purpose than proving whether something works or not. Yeah. I guess the other thing to note is this often is an arc in my, well, let's look, we'll come to the future soon, but in the past, historically, when I did developmental evaluation, it was often at the start of something, and often it did eventually move into more conventional evaluation. So it might be you have a DE phase, and then you move into more of an outcomes phase. For example, on a five-year initiative, it might say the first 2 years are developmental because we haven't fully worked out what to do, and we're working it out and designing elements and prototyping, but we do expect it to settle down and start to measure the outcomes. Yeah.
Right. So originally it had a really clear kind of purpose distinction from formative and summative, and it evolved alongside innovation and was designed to support the evaluation of the development of something. All right. What about now? What are you seeing how are you seeing DE used today? And I'd be really interested to know how the Canadian and the Australian contexts are also influencing this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can start, Zoe. I would say it's still very present in the evaluation space, but it's much more background than foreground. Certainly in my practice, I'm called on far less to do, quote, a developmental evaluation. And I think engage more broadly around like sort of a bigger challenge or a bigger initiative within which developmental evaluation gets included. I think part of that might be, I think sort of social innovation as sort of a leading term and idea is also going to the background. I think labs have faded as a sort of a direct kind of intervention. The funding for them has seemed to have gone away. That doesn't mean those skills aren't being applied, right? Or people aren't using the kind of sort of design thinking and probes and prototypes that are kind of accompany labs. I think that's very, very present, but it's much more embedded. And I think that's the same for DE. I think we also see a lot of organizations who've just built that practice, that it is actually part of how they function and work, and they've got that sort of intentional capacity around doing developmental work as part of their sort of ongoing. And I would say just, given the state of the world, people are very pragmatic right now, that I think there's sort of immediate, which to me doesn't preclude a need for DE. It might actually ramp up a need for DE, but I think there's sort of a front of mind focus where people are really, they're searching for leverage. They're trying to respond to crises. If they're involved in justice work or if they're involved in democracy work, they're trying to just hold ground. Not make progress. And so, I think there's a lot going on that just has people's front of mind attention that might not, have the same space for developmental evaluation that we saw maybe like 5 years ago, for example. And I think not new, but that orientation to systems is still, though, very present. I think people, when they're looking for leverage, are very much looking for leverage within larger systems because they see the need for change at scale. And so I think that search is very much there within a variety of domains right now here. Yeah, Jess, how about you? What's going on in
Something similar in Australia or?
Yeah, I mean, like different. I mean, I don't think, you're right next to the US, aren't you? And so we're over here. I do think that it's in the same way as in Canada, developmental evaluation is not being spoken about as much. There are less tenders around that specifically ask for developmental evaluation, but that doesn't mean we're not using it. It's really interesting. It's always gone, as you say, a bit undercover or in the background, but systems transformation is massive over here. And a lot of people are trying to learn about it, trying to do it. And of course, how do you do systems change work? What does evaluation look like in that space? It's very much developmental evaluation, particularly in the early stages, because often the systems transformation works longer term, and it's really messy at the beginning, and it was some different skill sets, like a lot of systems mapping, a lot of trying to understand what's going on with the system, a lot of that front end work, understanding different perspectives, lived experience of the system. And often people are getting referred to, instead of using the term DE in Australia, what I'm hearing a lot more is learning partner. So I'm getting employed as a learning partner, but I'm using DE skills all the time. And learning partnerships seem to also be allow you to give you the mandate to work in strategy side of it as well as in the evaluation side of it. So it expands the scope a little bit, I think. But there is a bit less spaciousness here as well. There's cuts, and I'm in Victoria. I don't know if anybody else online's in Victoria, but it's quite a tight fiscal environment. There's cuts happening. There's concerns about the global environment, interest rates, housing. So it is a little less spacious and a little more serious. I don't know how you say. People are really concerned. So I guess that with that comes, a focus on problem solving, maybe more, or systems change. So similar, but I think I'm imagining the context is even darker in Canada. I don't know. I'm guessing. Do you think so?
At moments in places, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you still finding, Jamie, you're using the DE toolkit, you're bringing your skills that you've got from developmental evaluation into these new spaces that you're operating in?
Oh, absolutely. I think there is a great need right now for testing quickly, finding solutions, learning fast, making quick adjustments, doing that as informed as possible. I think the link to strategy has always been there for DE, but I think I'm pulled a lot more into strategy work right now, and that just the DE toolkit is just so useful for operating in that space. So an absolute yes, Zoe, to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely more strategy. I don't know, maybe we were employed as pure developmental evaluators at the beginning, where we really weren't playing with it. We were informing iterations maybe of the strategy, but we weren't there for the starting point of the strategy. Whereas today we're getting brought in to help, work on the initial strategy, which is often systems transformation related. Yeah.
Great. And I'm going to ask you to both go into some, you said everyone's getting very pragmatic, Jamie. I'm going to ask you to give us some really specific examples of how you've used DE in your current work. Before I do that, I'd just like to throw a question to participants. Just building on this idea of DE being applied in multiple different contexts, and I'd love to know if there are any other contexts where you've seen developmental evaluation skills or toolkits being applied kind of beyond the label. So if you've got any thoughts on that, pop them into the webinar chat. And now I'll turn to Jess and Jamie. I'd really love to know what this looks like in practice. We've explored some of the ways that it's being applied, but what does it actually look like? Can you share an example, Jamie, of when developmental evaluation helped you kind of rewire a system or was applied in a context that was kind of less spacious than its original application?
Yeah, I'm going to reach back because I think this is a good example for that question. So it's this pre-pandemic initiative. It's still ongoing. I'll put the link to the initiative in the chat. But my intense involvement was in the early stages of development, and it was an initiative here in Canada called Nourish, and it was really about food in hospitals. So the idea of food in hospitals, from a hospital administrator perspective, is it's an expense line, and how do we manage that expense line to sort of minimize the cost? But what if we reimagined food as part of the healing, as something that was a lever for climate change in terms of the kinds of food being purchased and served? What if it was a lever for cultural understanding and connection into a space that often has been alien to Indigenous people? And so this initiative organized around that, and it was really trying to rewire the hospital system around how it thinks about food. And so I don't think DE ever tries to rewire a system, right? The DE is never the edge of the wedge that's trying to change something, but it is part of the support to those that are really trying to do that. And that's what was going on with this initiative. And so the innovation in this case was largely menu, right? Like seasonal local foods, more climate friendly foods, culturally appropriate foods. Some related activity happened around that, staff education and engagement, decision maker education engagement, community engagement. So you have that on one side, and then on the other side, you had a bunch of outcomes, right? So some of those are, very sort of classic hospital outcomes, patient experience, patient satisfaction, culturally competent care, but also, clinical outcomes, readmission rates, bed turnovers, things that hospital administrators significantly care about. And then, you could reach out a little bit beyond the hospital and say, well, we also have outcomes about sort of local food, local economy, community engagement. But if you're trying to rewire a system, what's in between that? And just earlier we were just chatting, and you talked about those elements of systems change, and there's various versions of these, but in essence, it's, shifts in beliefs, shifts in power and authority, shifts in resources, shifts in routines, shifts in policy, shifts in relationships. And so what DE did in this case was really having a very active scanning of these systems. So this was sort of a innovator network model. You had a bunch of people who were already leading edge within their own hospitals, doing some really neat things around menus. They were supported. They supported one another. They were encouraged. They were invested in. But what was the DE role was like, let a whole bunch of people who are already motivated to do something do more, and then watch them really carefully and support them and learn about what are early signals emerging around any one of these, because that might be the thing we want to get behind in terms of a strategy sort of thing. And so the DE revealed in early days that like procurement processes were a big barrier. The ability to actually work within these large buying systems to get outside of that to buy local food, or to even have the rules in place where you could access local food from an indigenous community as part of their natural harvesting and have that available in the hospital for members of their community. That required a workaround in terms of many of those sort of local hospital practices. The connection across different departments to really get behind this, like, was really another lever that started to emerge. The ability to enable decision makers to make budget commitments to do this within their hospital budgets became a big lever. So over time, a lot of these things emerged that shaped the next iterations of the initiative, based on a pretty broad set of sort of wide open experimentation, supporting people that were really, really keen to do it. I mean, the DE was very simple. It was just a lot of engagement with those that were doing stuff and the people around them within these hospitals, and learning from them, but looking for the patterns across those around where leverage points might be emerging that could be tapped into going forward. So maybe I'll pause there. I mean, Zoe, you might have follow-up questions or things you might want me
Can I
to
ask a
expand, or you too,
question?
Jess? You
Yeah,
bet, Jess.
I
Yeah.
think I'm just really curious about whether DE is leading it or whether DE is supporting. So were there innovators, or was there another group leading the work, or were you next to them, or were you, just so I understand the difference?
Yeah, there was a group leading the work. So it was initially conceived of and led within Canadian Foundation. It was a foundation-led initiative. It's since spun out and become its own entity. But there's a core team of folks inside and some outside the foundation that were, their job was to lead this and
Yeah.
to sort of manage it, activate it, guide it,
And you were
and very much drawing from that larger community of people who were part of it. Like they were quite invested in its direction from the
great
outset.
example.
I love this notion of rewiring the system. And it almost, what came up for me while I was listening to you, Jamie, is this sense of humility in saying, well, if we're rewiring the system, all everything's on the table in terms of we need to understand these deeper ways of working, power dynamics, and we're using this exploratory approach to kind of learn and then adapt in response to what we learn, rather than assuming that we know what's best for the system. That's so developmental. Jess, do you have an example you can share with us as well, just to really hone in on the
Yeah.
practical application of developmental evaluation?
Yeah, well, I might start with a general one and go to a specific one if that's okay. So, quite a few of the projects or clients that I work with at the moment, I'm working at the organisational level, and I'm working with quite a few foundations. In fact, if there is a space which is a bit more spacious in Australia, from my perspective, it's working with foundations who are, there seems to be a bit of a shift in progressive foundations to focus more on learning and more on high trust philanthropy. And in that space, there seems to be a real interest in applying some of the developmental concepts. But in particular, there's two or three, in fact, of the philanthropic organisations that I'm working with have strategies that specifically measure some systems shifts, such as power shifts. So are different people getting voice than before? Resource flows, changes in who's connected to who, changes in policies and practices and mindsets. And so they're using the waters of systems change. If those of you, we'll put that link in, which is a sort of like simplification of Danilo Meadows' levers in a way. So there's sort of 6, which work really well. And so there's quite a widespread use, and we've been evaluating against that. So it's a very pragmatic way of doing it. It's like actually tracking, are there power shifts going on? Are different people getting a voice in decisions across the system that you're working with? So that's not a specific example, but a specific practice that hopefully is helpful. And then I guess the second example I wanted to use is almost the difference where the developmental evaluator is almost leading the work. And it's not called developmental evaluation, but I'm really tracking this new thread that I'm seeing, and that is human learning systems. Toby Lowe wrote about human learning systems, which is sort of like re-envisaging how the public sector works, really, but with a really strong focus on learning, social learning. So looking at what's working, doing that problem solving, Jamie, at a sort of at a bigger scale maybe. And there was a case study that was published, so I'll talk about that. It's not actually my work. It's always hard to share examples because they're not published. So, but this one is beautifully written up. So this is the Front Project and Ryan Martin who've produced this. And it's about how to embed human learning systems in the child and family support system in South Australia. So there's 4 elements. It's a great case study too. We'll give you the link for this. There's 4 elements to the work. There was the data piece. So they've got data linkage. So they're looking at all the families who are at risk of having their kids taken away in this area in South Australia. So data linkage. But there's also a lived experience network. So they're constantly listening to the voices of people, lived experience of that system. And then there's the various communities of practice that are meeting together and looking at the data and listening to the voices. But the main mechanism for change, Jamie, is what they call relational contracting. Have you heard about that? So in this system, there's sort of 10 not-for-profits working with government, all trying to work on this system together. And of course, the 10 not-for-profits have contracts in which and KPIs. And so one of the main things they can do is change the KPIs in response to enable the sort of work that needs to happen. And just that alone, which sounds, and it's constantly stewarding the system and learning. Social learning is all through the system. The reason why it's such a good case study is they're getting results. Getting results are exciting. So the child protection orders, or the number of kids that need to go into out of home care has gone down, and this is after just a couple of years. And also the engagement rates, that's the number of referrals that are actually being followed up by families, has gone up quite a lot. So from about 60% to 80%, so quite a big increase. So it's really nice to see all of that, an example that's written up. So, but then I'm thinking about what's the role of the facilitator in all that? Because you're working with data, you're working with lived experience, you're working on what needs to happen. And to me, that sounds like DE. It sounds like DE, but in a big complex system. So I think there's a lot of excitement about human learning systems in Australia. It's coming out of the UK with Toby Lowe's work, but it's beginning to be applied in different settings. I'm hearing it being talked about a lot. We're in the early stages, but it's really nice to have a case study, and it's great for the Front Project to have written that up and shared it. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Brilliant examples. I heard you say as well, Jess, that referrals went up. I feel like that's a really interesting one to highlight in systems change. Sometimes when you're changing a system, your indicators look worse or things start to look a little bit worse.
The
But
referrals didn't
actually,
go up, the engagement rate went up. So that means
oh, right.
when you're given a referral, families don't always, they don't go through with it. They don't follow it up. They don't go to the service. But in this case, the engagement rate is what they call it. So people
Okay.
following up and engaging in the services that they've been,
Yeah.
it was higher. And with for
Increase in
Aboriginal
kind of.
families in particular, which is fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, great, excellent. Well, I'll share one quick example, but I'd love to remind people that you can put your questions in the Q&A for Jess and Jamie. We're going to jump into Q&A in a second. I just quickly wanted to share there are examples of this work being done with government as well, of government initiating this kind of work. And one I've just coming to the end of is stewardship of aged care, which was a recommendation of the Royal Commission for the Department of Health and Aged Care to adopt a stewardship approach, which meant the allocation of new staff on the ground, but also a shift in government taking responsibility for stewarding the aged care system. In Australia, we have an ageing population, and so there's going to be increasing demand on the aged care system. And we began this evaluation with this very luxurious, I want to say, or, the opportunity to do 6 months of discovery work to actually help build the model. What does it look like for public servants to steward a system? And so we helped build the model from the ground up, thinking about the culture, the mindsets, the shifts in practices that needed to occur in order for the public service to get out there and actually steward the system. So there are some good examples of where government is needing to think really quickly and respond rapidly and perhaps implement things that they are in the process of building. And I think, it's important to note that sometimes big reforms in government require different approaches to evaluation as well when you're really trying to change or rewire the system, as you say, Jamie.
A
So
perfect example, Zoe, of like when there's reform, there's quite a few areas in Australia, I'm sure you've got the same in Canada, Jamie, but where there is reform, rapid reform, DE is a perfect partner. In fact, what other evaluation could you do when the policies are coming out at a rate of knots and everything's changing? How do you work with that? So we've had good experience with that as a great role. Again, they may not always call it DE. In this case, they did, though, didn't they, Zoe? Yeah.
they did, yeah, that's right. Jamie, any comments on that, or are you seeing any of that in Canada?
Well, I might pick up one thing you said earlier. I think you said about what's on the table. There was some you made a comment about stuff being on the table, and I think I'm seeing a limitation sometime around DE when not enough is on the table. Right, the thing is more baked, and then we come into a DE mode, and we're really in sort of the improvement category versus sort of a full-on development category. And if that's where you're at, and some evaluation is useful, it's all good. But I think sometimes we've got to loosen those boundaries around what might be possible. And so there's some, strategy techniques we can look to. One I've been playing with a lot lately is called corner solutions, where you really sort of try and identify three, four sort of wildly different options. And you sort of imagine those as corners of a room, but you try and make this room as big as possible, as part of a strategy process to think about what might be possible. The exercise really encourage you to think through, if we went all in on this one, what would that look like? What would the benefits be? What would the implications be? But I think there's a huge role for then DE to follow those and say, okay, our solution is often an integration of, two or three of these. but were our assumptions right? And was our bet right? And did we frame these the right way? And what's actually playing out on the ground relative to that thinking? I think the more we can expand early on in that strategy process, the box of potential, the more we might get to some of the press responses to some of the pressing challenges that we're really, really seeing. But we support that with strong DE. So I think what you were saying earlier just made me
Is that written up
prompted that
anywhere,
for me.
Jamie? Corners, that
It's
sounds
not.
cool.
It
I'm
needs
sure
to
we'd
be.
love
I
to hear
think.
about that.
Yeah. No. I think there's a case for it to be written up. I think not a lot of people have been playing with the two together yet. So I think that's something I'm doing now and encouraging others to do, and maybe we'll take that up at some point.
Okay, so we're going to jump into some audience questions soon. Before we do, just like to do some plugs of upcoming opportunities for you to learn a little bit more about developmental evaluation. Clear Horizon has an 8-week course starting on the 24th of April, and it's all focused on developmental evaluation. It's really practical. It includes different roles that come up in developmental evaluation, the 8 key principles which guide a lot of the work that we're doing, and I think are still completely relevant to current contexts. And it includes a lot of the approaches and tools. And Jamie and Jess both designed the original course. And so a lot of the approaches and tools,
And Kate
and Kate McKegg.
Yes.
So a lot of the approaches and tools that you've heard about might be kind of covered in the course, certainly the ways of working. I also really love, I'll be leading that course, and I love how participants bring real life challenges, and we have opportunities to kind of support each other in navigating what is quite complex terrain when you're working in a developmental way, and sometimes emerging, kind of talking about some of the key tensions that come up in this work, like balancing, how do you balance inclusion with efficiency, for example? How do you be participatory and engage lots of different people in a rapid way? There are lots of tensions that emerge in developmental evaluation, and this is a great space to get community support with that. So if you would like to attend, we're offering a 15% discount if you book before the end of April using the code WEB15OFF, and don't worry, you'll get an email with that, and Giovanni might put it in the chat. Jess or Jamie, do you have anything you want to plug before we move into questions?
There's a couple of papers that have come out recently. I mentioned collective noticing, if people are interested in that. I think we've written a paper, it's free, of course, so you can have a look at that if you're interested. And another one on adaptive progress markers, which is a little bit about how to, when you can't use targets, what do you use instead when you're being asked for more accountability and transparency against what you're doing. So there's 2 papers, they're both free. So you can have a look at them if you're interested. They're the latest things we've been writing about here.
Yeah. Right. So people have been a bit coy with the questions. Andrew has got one. We've got one question, and then I might just jump in and ask a few of my own. Andrew asks, I'm curious whether the work that you did with DE sprints ended up enabling the organisation to develop a more stable theory of change. Jess, I might throw that one to you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Did it come to a more stable one? Well, I mean, it often does. Well, I would actually use the stewardship example. Zoe, maybe you answer it. I'm going to throw it to you because I know that you did a lot of work on theory of change in that example, didn't you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And so we used almost like a grounded theory approach where we went in and actually asked some very open questions and built the model from the ground up. And we did build a theory of change. We got some really positive feedback that it kind of adequately reflected the work that was happening on the ground. People really appreciated that they could see their voice in the theory of change. But it's interesting, I would question this notion of a stable theory of change in developmental evaluation, because I think the theory of change can always be updated. We're always learning in developmental evaluation, and at various points throughout the evaluation, it's important to revisit your theory of change and think about, does this still hold? What's changed? And so I think that's really important. Don't just do a theory and think that it lasts forever.
I always say, Zoe, that a theory of change is never right and it's never finished. That's my view on a theory of change, because it's your best idea. It's your best theory at the time. But I do find they change less, like with our town, which has been a 10-year developmental evaluation, which is it's such a luxury to be on such a long journey. We're 5 years in, and it's certainly not changing as fast as it did at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew's written some fantastic things in the chat about social change being problematized. I'll draw from a few of questions. I'd love to know, Jamie, I might throw this one to you. What's one thing you wish more people understood about developmental evaluation?
I think there's a myth out there that it sort of doesn't pay attention, or there's no place for outcomes, right? That I think, that DE is like evaluation without outcomes. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because I think the reason you're trying to do something is to achieve some kind of change. And so that outcome may not be fully defined. Maybe the scope or pace by which you might get to that outcome may be quite uncertain. The mechanisms that really drive towards that may not be really clear. But there is no absence of outcome. There is a change that is desired, and to the previous one, and you probably have some theories about how you drive towards that change. But the purpose of DE is to clarify, tighten, refine, test a whole bunch of things in service of getting to that outcome ultimately.
Yes, it's all about the outcome, really, isn't it? It's just with a less certain plan of how you get there. Yeah. Nice.
And Jess, can you share a moment when Dee revealed something unexpected or shifted the direction of the work?
It's always doing that. There's many times in which Dee shifts the direction of the work because it's just such a big discovery process. I'm trying to think of an example. This is hard to suddenly come up with one off. Come back to me and I'll think of one. I need a minute to think. Yeah. Or maybe Jamie's got one.
Do you have any examples top of mind, Jamie?
That's a tough one. I think, yeah, I'd have to think about that one. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think it's always something that emerges, but, there's no like standout example that really jumps to mind quickly. Yeah. Do you have one, Zoe?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's always revealing unexpected things, and it should be shifting the direction of the work as well. I think that's always a key indication for me of when something is perhaps not developmental, is when the evaluation is revealing things, but implementers are not changing their approach, because that to me signals that they're actually operating in more of a formative, got a model already formed in their head of how this is going to work. So yeah, there are a couple of examples from stewardship. We discovered a few things quite early on about the nature of stewardship being very connected to, very much about the relationship between staff on the ground and those in policy. And so that became a big focus of the department, was thinking about the feedback loops from policy to staff on the ground. And they actually started implementing some tools to support staff on the ground, or public servants on the ground, to feed feedback and intel into the policy teams so that policy teams could respond more proactively to concerns coming from the ground. So it was this really interesting finding where we were thinking about the ecosystem of government and needing to be this responsive system that supports the integration of intel from the ground into policy. So that's a good example.
I thought of one now.
Yes,
Yeah.
great.
Our Town. So the Our Town is put the initiative is this job that's 10 years for me and for the towns. So which is incredible to have this long arc. And I just remember early on, like we went into in the early days, we started with this idea. It was about mental health and well-being, and I guess the assumption would be that it was going to be about tweaking services or changing what services were available in towns. But that was totally not what it became at all. It completely shifted from here right over here, and it became a lot about embodying mentally healthy practices, mentally healthy in the way you embody it, and the people living in the towns embodied it. And it was one of the strongest mechanisms, was this living and being vulnerable and talking about your own experiences was this incredible, powerful lever that we just had not, I certainly didn't have it on my radar, and it didn't seem to be what was being talked about. And the whole purpose of the initiative moved much more towards well-being and almost changing the culture of towns. It was incredible, some of the shifts, and that flowed into the theory of change and so forth. But yeah, I think it's when you see a purpose shift, so even the outcomes and the aim shifts, that you know you're really moving. Yeah.
Okay, Judy
I have
has.
one too now,
Oh, you've
Zoe.
got one?
Yeah.
Go for it,
Yeah, I
Jamie.
just needed, but I don't think as radical a shift as Jess's example, but was involved with an initiative around social emotional learning in schools. And the original conception was very much around, curriculum and students and sort of the experience that students have to try and sort of cultivate that within them. The learning through the course of the work, DE revealed or helped to reveal that the teacher well-being was a critical part of this equation, which I don't think was, one of the original considerations. So often there's sort of an expansive element or an additional element. I think that as we learn about the nature of the system and all of its elements, the scope of the solution set can grow.
Yeah. I'm always surprised as well by the value of just asking people people really involved in something. Often they're in touch with some of the key issues that might not even be in the literature or in, understood at the design or kind of policy making level. But you ask people on the ground, they seem to be able to very quickly tell you what's really going on. Judy has a brilliant question for us. Any advice from the panel on how to convince more traditional funders, particularly in the health sector where they come from a research mindset, that a more DE type approach would be more appropriate than a traditional mid or endpoint evaluation? Strategies.
I remember listening to the beginning of the stewardship program where they actually, this is federal government, Department of Health, put out a tender for developmental evaluation. So there you go, it can happen, just tell you that. But I was thinking about how they got to that point. I think they got to that point by doing regular evaluation, and it's simply not being helpful at all. Nothing wrong with what the evaluators did, but the context was so transient, wasn't it, Zoe, that a traditional evaluation wasn't useful. So I wonder whether, I'm not so sure you can tell people. I've never been very successful at persuading people with words, but if you can look at how has it gone so far with you doing traditional evaluation, what's been the value of it, what have you got from it? Sometimes you can see that it's not working. I don't know. That's my most effective way has been when people realise that traditional evaluation, they try it, doesn't work. Yeah.
Jamie?
Yeah, not an easy task. I think two ideas and purely ideas. One is, I think, you've got to set the case for the nature of the problem you're trying to solve and why it is inherently complex and why the limitations of a classic sort of research model or evaluation model in trying to address that problem. I think, laying that out. But then I would use risk management language, right? Because I think if that kind of funder mindset is there, then DE can be a risk mitigation strategy. If you're making really big, you're making big bets on certain interventions or very complex and expensive research designs, and they're premature, you're blowing money away. And so I think if you can sort of position DE as a first stage, make sure we're right before we, small bets before big bets kind of intervention, then you might have half a chance, but it's not,
Great, Jamie. I've used that before. I'd forgotten I've used that framing, talking about DE can de-risk early stage designs. I remember doing a developmental evaluation on a social innovation that was very early stage, and that's the language we use, and it went down pretty well because they weren't seeing much coming out of the design either. And so for them, some of it was, you will get a report on what's worked and what hasn't. And I know ODE is not about the report, and it wasn't where we were focusing our effort, but it did comfort the department that they were going to get a look in at what had and hadn't worked, and to understand the rigor and the research behind the testing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They're really good points. It'd be great to have also some resources to point to, I think, as well, to say developmental evaluation is a really well-established approach to evaluation. There's lots of literature out there. There are a lot of fantastic examples. I know even from the United States, some of the work that I've seen coming out of it doesn't necessarily call itself DE, but calls itself systems transformation. Some of the evaluations I've seen done in the health sector there, where they've engaged across multiple systems, have been fantastic. So even just sharing some of the reports that are out there and available to demonstrate to people, this is how you make sense of complexity. It's not easy, but there are some examples out there of how you can do that. Andrew has a question as well. I find myself thinking a lot about how social issues are problematized. I think programs often achieve what they set out to do, but do little to shift the actual social issue. And that is because they may be trying to solve the wrong problem. So I'm interested in how that problem definition space sits within developmental evaluation. Jamie?
Yeah, it's an excellent insight. I think it's very fair. I think they probably are my hunch would be they're solving part of the problem, but not the problem manifests in so many dimensions that it's not solving many, many pieces of it. That's a bit of a guess. I think DE can help in two ways. One, just by naming, the assumption around the problem and the framing, and then the design choices that were made as a result of that, and then just simple evaluation of the efficacy of those towards solving the problem. Because I think that may reveal to people, I mean, it's nothing different than what Andrew's just laid out here, but I think it's like sort of playing back people's logic to them around the choice of framing, design, intervention, result, and then generating alternatives. The other thing that could be going on is that maybe that there are multiple parties and players who actually think they're talking about the same problem and maybe think they have the same understanding of what it is and what to do about it. But underneath that, they've actually got different assumptions around what it is, how to solve it, implicit theories of change. And so the more that those can get surfaced, the better there's a chance of whoever it is kind of coming around the table to work on something might have half a chance of generating something that can respond to it. It sounds obvious, but I think that's often not clear for folks. And it only gets revealed when people actually start to do something and they make choices. They make choices about sort of money or priority or where their time goes or what gets shaped when and how on the ground or when conflict arises. Often that's a point of revealing some of those assumptions. And so I think if the DE is situated close to the action, they can be paying attention to those, feeding them back, and again, linking it back into the kind of strategy conversation that people need to be having around this stuff. But yeah, I appreciate that question. Jess?
Oh, I think you nailed it.
We're going to do one final question because we've got 5 minutes left. I'll give this one to you, Jess. What advice would you give to someone trying to apply DE in contexts with limited time, space, or resourcing? Not that that ever happens, but just in case it did.
Oh, God. I mean, like, DE does take time and it does need space. Let's just be honest here. And to do it often it can be quite, if you bring an outside developmental evaluator in, it can take quite a lot of time, so it can be expensive. So the first thing is, that's a big challenge, but I always think that you can get benefit from collective learning, and sometimes that can be achieved in a fairly simple way by bringing all your data together and have a facilitated sense-making session. And that maybe doesn't need as much support from outside if that's what you're thinking. of getting outside support to like really help guide people through that learning and look at the data and test your assumptions and look at your original ideas. You can make, that's probably to me one of the most valuable intersection points, is that coming together and actually looking at the data and testing your assumptions. So you might be that you have just maybe not a full DE, but you have some support for bits, or maybe you have people in-house who have that skill set, but to actually prioritize it. Because I feel like that's what doesn't happen, is people don't stop and look and make sense. That's often, there is lots of data, but are you actually looking at it? Are you actually using it? Are you learning together? I would say that that's not super expensive part of the process, and it's really valuable. Don't know if that's my base. What do you think, Jamie?
Yeah, I think you can do low budget versions. You just have to manage your expectations. I think focusing, like just pick one slice of the puzzle and zero in on that, not try and DE the whole thing. Like what is the area where it would be most useful? And then if it is an internal role, give them license and permission to play that role. I think often it becomes side of desk or encumbered with other expectations, and they can't sort of freely be that sort of critical friend that I think a DE so valuably can be. And so you've got to set them up for success. And sometimes that doesn't happen particularly when
Culture.
someone's in an internal role.
Setting a learning culture is not necessarily expensive. It can be very hard if you don't have one, but actually working at building a learning culture where it is okay to talk about what's not working and it is okay to test assumptions through a process. That's not the expensive part of it. That's a journey and a commitment and a leadership commitment. So I guess making sure, if you are a leader yourself, is committing and working on creating a culture where it is okay to talk about what's not working. It's amazing how many organizations don't do that. How many settings don't do that? They just want to know what's worked. Just give me the good news. That's not. DE is very interested in what's not working as well.
Yeah, and I would second that, Jess and Jamie. And I think that process of reflection, people seem to really appreciate having the time to just step back from the doing of the work to reflect on the work, on how things are going, on what could be done differently. And sometimes they're not afforded that time. And the developmental evaluation actually can be a good justification for just stopping and pausing and reflecting on how we're going. We're pretty much at time now. So thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, Jess and Jamie, for your wise insights gained over many, many years. It's very interesting to hear that the environment, the context is really shifting, and that you're using DE principles and practices and sometimes not calling it DE, but that's okay. It's still really applicable. So thanks for letting us into all your insights. We're going to be sharing links to resources mentioned in the discussion today. There will also be a short feedback survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar, and you'll receive that survey via email if you don't have time to complete it after the session. Just so you know, we do listen to and read all that feedback, and we do take it on board, and it helps us plan our future webinars. So we really appreciate you taking the time to give us feedback. Thanks all for joining us today, and go well in your evaluation and non-evaluation adventures.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jamie.
Zoe. Bye, everybody.